important time for us to really reassert the important roles that corporations play. And this is an area in which boards can be incredibly helpful.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion have become critical priorities in the business world. Empirical evidence demonstrates that companies with diverse leadership and oversight are better performing companies and create greater long-term value.
Inclusion takes hard work. And part of what we have to do, those of us who are in leadership positions, is to create a culture where people feel comfortable telling their stories, where they feel comfortable bringing their full selves to work, where we send the signal that we value diversity and that we want to create a culture that's inclusive.
The more diverse inputs that you have into solving a given problem, the better the outcomes and the better performance overall. That includes women, that includes men and women of color. It includes lots of underrepresented groups that can chime in and really bring a different perspective to decision making, make better decisions, and have better outcomes.
Please welcome the President and CEO at Amalgamated Bank, Priscilla Brown.
Hello. How exciting is this? First of all, to be back in a room and to be in a room with so many like-minded people, people who understand the mission that we all have. And as corporate leaders, we don't just have a mission, we're on a mission. It is our obligation to stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to use our voice to make this a core tenet of our corporate vision and our values. The time for these conversations has never been more important than now, and this morning we are setting the stage with an amazing panel of individuals to inspire you. Today's first panel is titled DEI-Focused Boards, and joining us on stage for conversation is first Valerie Jarrett, President of the Barack Obama Foundation and Director of Lyft, Ralph Lauren, and the Walgreens Boots Alliance. In-hee Cho Sa, General Manager, Strategic Partnerships of IBM and the Director of DocuSign. Stephen Tanda, President and Chief Executive Officer of Aptar. And to moderate the conversation, Carla Harris, Vice Chair and Managing Director of Morgan Stanley and Director of Cummins Inc. and Walmart. Welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. And let me first say, Pamela, we're not going to get to the point where we don't need this breakfast. In fact, I would argue that it has to be even bigger because it's important to celebrate those companies who are getting it right and who are making it happen. When people see that other folks are successful at doing that which we're trying to accomplish, then everybody gets on board. So I would argue that we're going to need a bigger space in about 3 or 4 years. Okay, so I want to start off by saying welcome to my esteemed panelists, and today we're going to talk about not only women on boards, but women of color in specific, because it's a decidedly different conversation once you get a woman in the room and once you get a person of color in the room. And so we're going to start off by having each of the panelists talk a little bit about who they are, the boards they're on, and the experience that they have on those boards, and answer the question at the end of, what are you doing with respect to getting other women and other women of color on the boards that you sit on? And we'll start with you, Valerie.
Well, good morning, everyone. What a beautiful room this is. I could not be more delighted to be here. So I'm on several boards. I'm on Walgreens Boots Alliance, Ralph Lauren, Lyft, and Sweetgreen, and Aero Investment. And we make it a priority to look around and broaden the circle. And as I said in the video, I think that it is really important to view diversity as a strength that gives us a competitive advantage. And the question is, what are you doing to make people who are from diverse backgrounds feel welcome? It's not enough just to bring them in the door, but they have to feel that they can thrive in the door. And so we use our networks. And let's face it, if you ask a woman to name some very talented women of color, they're much more likely able to do it than a bunch of guys will. And so you've got to talk to the right people. And you have to build a network of credible folks who you can rely on to say, not just checking a box, but who's going to bring value to the table, who has a background and substantive experience in addition to their gender, in addition to their racial background. And if you make it a priority and you focus the conversation in a very deliberate way, results happen.
Mm-hmm. And he.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Inhi, and I lead our global strategic partnerships at IBM. I've been with IBM actually more than 20 years and have been now part of DocuSign's board of directors for the last 3.5 years. The combination of being in both what I consider a 100-plus-year-old company plus maybe a teenager in the spectrum of going public, you get the spectrum of not only an understanding of history and importance of institutional transformation, but you also get an understanding of what it means to be relevant for the current times and how you have to be current in terms of thinking about talent and the issues. One of the things that I'm passionate about, which Dan knows, he's the CEO of DocuSign, is the advancement of women, and especially women in STEM. I'm also on the board of Anita B., which is the Anita Borg Institute, one of the largest nonprofits for the advancement of women in technology, which also sponsors the Grace Hopper Conference. And what we're going to talk about today is really intentionality. And so if you really want to change the board, you have to be intentional. It will not just happen because time passes.
For sure. Stefan.
Yeah, I'm really humbled and honored to be amongst this prestigious group. I've sat there in 2017 with my first breakfast, and was my first year as CEO of APTA Group, and I said, oh, boy, I better latch on to this group. Our great audit chair, Maritza Gomez-Montiel, couldn't make it last-minute conflict, so I'm happy to step in and provide the CEO perspective. And allow me the 30-second commercial as the CEO. So I know you've never heard of us, but you all have our product at home. We're a B2B company that makes that little engine that can in your fragrance pump, in your drug delivery, nasal spray, all the way to Narcan, beauty products, all the way to putting the Heinz ketchup upside down. So it's a technology manufacturing company. 80% of our population is outside of the US and 2/3 of our revenue. Now, back to your question. So I'm really proud of our board. In 2017, we had a good board. They hired me. Must be a good board. We had a good board in 2017. Today, we have a great board. We've partly through the motivation provided here, added 2 people of color. Now we have 30% person of color on the board. We added 2 women, sadly lost one to illness. We have 40% women on boards. And I also want to make the point, we added 2 nationalities, so half of our board hails from outside of the US, which given our international presence is very important. One example, we're the largest employer in the Normandy region, 5,000 people in France. I need one director who knows her way around the French government. We also changed the scope of our comp committee to really be management development and diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, our chair of that committee, Giovanna Campori-Monas, made a trip from Europe to be here with us today. And all of our committees were chaired by women until very recently. So, of course, similar progress in the C-suite, because the board expects you to walk your talk. Overall, tremendous impact on the business, tremendous impact on the ability to recruit talent, not only to the board, but to the C-suite and on down. And of course, championing the careers for women all across the board. And that's really been a great experience.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, Stefan, because you provoked the question based on what Valerie said. This sounds like the board that Stefan built. And Valerie made the point that if you ask any woman on your board or in your network, she's going to have a list of really strong, qualified women to go on your board. So how difficult or not was it for you to actually make the moves that you made on the board that you built? Because unfortunately, still in 2021, we still hear people say, I can't find any, or it's difficult. So talk to us about that experience.
I think the notion of you can't find is almost ridiculous. It's half the population. And there's great talent out there. The challenge more is, what can I do, what can we do to attract that talent? And obviously, we work with recruitment partners. There's a great one here, I hear. But you got to be very specific what you're looking for. And like in any other business project that you have, if you, as an analogy, want to build a plant in China, and the contractor comes back, I better build it in Indonesia. And say, well, what didn't you not understand about the spec? So being very clear about the spec, being very clear about the outcomes, like in any other business project, is point one. And then we have to do our job to really develop the value proposition for the director. Directors want to come on the board to make a difference, have an impact. For that, they need to understand the value, the purpose of the company, and have complete access to information, to the talent. Any of my directors can visit the site, and they are visiting sites. They're expected to mentor at least 2 top talents, and that way really get into the fabric of the company. Now, they also want to make sure that they don't get in trouble by joining their own company. So ESG, sustainability, all of this got to be top rate. And over time, we've been recognized by all the rating bodies and magazines. We just were named number 8 amongst Forbes women-friendly companies. So for a little company, those give the director comfort that not only is this a great company with a great purpose, but they are not going to make a mistake. And they join a fun group of people. Now, it's not all fun and games. We expect them to travel twice a year overseas for board meetings. As I said, mentor people, but it kind of feeds on itself. And once you are down that road, it's much easier to attract directors, and they are out there.
Okay, thanks. So let's talk a little bit. I want to come back to this intentionality point, because that is how you get it done. And I want to talk about the intentionality of your voice in the room and what contribution you're making. But let's talk about the advantages for a company to have a diverse woman on the board. What's the real advantage for them? I know as a member of the Walmart board, one of the things that I thought that I could bring to the table was the fact that Walmart was very important in my community growing up. It was not only the place where people could go to buy goods for their home at a price that made sense for their earnings, but it was also a place where people were employed. It meant it was also a great philanthropist. So from my perspective, I could speak as a consumer, as a 30-year plus investment banker, as somebody who is a strategist. So there were a lot of different contributions, and frankly, as a woman and a woman of color, because being one of the largest employers in the country, it matters what they do from a labor perspective, and making sure that there's equity across the board is something that I could also lend my voice to. But let's talk about the advantages. And Nikki, I'll start with you and then go to Valerie.
So one of the skills I learned very early and have been both a beneficiary of, and I also consider a steward of, is the progressive policies IBM's always had in terms of the advancement of women and the advancement of talent around the world. So embodying that meant for probably the last 7-8 years, I've been the co-chair of the Executive Women's Council, which is thoughtful about the acceleration of the pipeline of talent, especially across technology, where we have even a bigger gap in solving advancement. And when I had the opportunity to join the DocuSign board, it was such a great combination of heralding and supporting a platform that everyone interacts with. You have a meaningful DocuSign moment, right? You bought a lease, in terms of a contract or a house, or you bought a car, or you're having a life moment that's so meaningful. And the platform is both at the transformation of what I consider your digital sort of workflows at a very simple point. Now you can sign a contract, which in the past you had a PDF, you print, you got to find a printer, you got to do a wet signature. It just seems so foreign in the world of COVID that we just went through. One of the pieces that not only do I bring to the table in terms of technology and product understanding and content, the other dimension I bring is very much who I am in terms of my background. I was originally born in Seoul, South Korea. So of Korean American descent, raised in the United States. And during the conversations last year and this year around racial injustice, representation, you can have a much more candid conversation, both in the boardroom as well as actually in the communities and on the teams. One of the things Dan actually did was host a day of understanding. And I participated with Dan for the entire DocuSign employee base. We did the similar parallel of those conversations within IBM around race and the notion of embracing identity and race and helping managers. So my point is, as a board member, you have the opportunity not only provide your operating skills, you actually have an opportunity to coach, mentor, and represent in a very forward way to say this dimension of race is such an important dialogue and you can't avoid it. And if anything, you become stronger when you understand, okay, what are the policies in place? How do you think about representation? How do you think about composition of the current board? How do you think about the leadership currently? How do you think about the evolution of talent building? And those are the things that I bring to the board in addition to my technology background.
Thank you. And Valerie?
So Carla, I think similar to you, I was thinking about the boards on which I serve. I love their products. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not in a Walgreens store. I sleep on Ralph Lauren sheets every single night, love them, and recommend them to you highly. I eat at Sweetgreen, and I'm on Lyft at least 2, 3, 4 times a day. And I know the products, I know what I like about them. I know, I always talk to the drivers whenever I'm in a Lyft car. I wanna know, why do you drive for Lyft? Have you ever driven for the competition? How are things going in the midst of COVID? Is your family safe? Do you feel like we're providing enough safety in the cars for? You have to talk to the people in the industries if you actually care about the product. And so being willing, I mean, I know the store manager of the Walgreens by my neighborhood. I know the pharmacist by name. This is get back to the point of, I guess, intentionality and getting involved and having a pulse of what's happening on the ground. And I enjoy bringing that to the table. I obviously had experience 8 years in Washington. So I've been from the perspective of public policy, from regulators, from how you interface with government. And let's face it, right now, everybody in this room is interfacing in some way with government. Right. It's affecting your lives. And I think there was a long period of time where particularly CEOs and board members really didn't want to have much to do with Washington. They would send their lobbyists. And I will say, during the time I was there, CEOs showed up because it was so important what the government was doing that was going to affect their ability to invest and grow in this country. And so I think bringing that experience of 8 years in Washington has been helpful to the table, as well as the experience I have on the ground with all of the products that I'm involved with. Ariel Investments, my dad was one of the first investors there 35 years ago. I know that company up, backwards, and forwards. I knew the founder when he was a kid. So, and the personal connection is really important. And I think one of the advice that I give women, and it's important that we're celebrating the companies that have women on their boards. But for those of you who are considering going on a board, it's a two-way street. It's not just that they want you, you have to want them. And I think one of the questions you have to ask yourself before joining a board is, what is the niche that I'm fulfilling? What is it that they don't have at the table that I can contribute? In addition to just being a smart, experienced, responsible person, what's unique about me? And I ask that question. I'm very open in saying, well, why do you want me on the board? And when people call me and they're looking for people on the boards, I say, tell me what you want in addition to their race and their gender. And be very, again, back to the concept of intentionality about it. And then you're filling out the table. And as you do, I think the other thing that we should talk about here today is culture in the boardroom. And does everybody feel as though they can come to the table and bring their full set of experiences? Because that's why we're there. And if it's not an environment where you're comfortable doing that, then you're not likely to thrive. And then the final point I would make is that you are a role model on the board. And so for all of my boards, I've done town halls with the affinity groups. I feel as though I'm representing. You can't be what you can't see. And I want the women and the people of color in those organizations to see that it is a priority of the CEO and the board to have diversity around the table. And then that should motivate them. And then the other point I'd make, I see Brian sitting here, so I can't go without mentioning Brian Moynihan has an advisory board that Maggie, who serves on the Lyft board with me, where are you, Maggie? I saw you over there, got me involved in, where we're mentoring the senior women at Bank of America. And in the process, I'm finding prospects for new board members. Haven't told Brian that yet, but I'm really very interested in recruiting some of his senior women on boards. And so you've got to be willing to extend yourself in that way as well. It doesn't have to just be the corporate board with a fiduciary responsibility. Advisory boards are extremely important too.
Yes, and you just enumerated a number of roles that board members and specifically women of color can play within organizations, especially now that we are in the war for talent, and especially now that millennials and Zers have become the dominant population in the workforce. They care very much about this, and they will continue to exercise their voices and ask the question. Not to mention shareholders, as I like to say, that the ESG that everybody's focusing on, the S is quickly becoming the D around diversity, right? So you're going to have to answer the question, you know, and Ken, you were someone years ago who was exemplary in actually talking about what the numbers look like at Merck. And now many companies are following. He was early, but he knew it was coming, that people were going to ask the question, and no longer can you say we don't disclose those numbers. You're going to have to think about how you want to position it, because it's going to be out there, and your board is going to have to answer around that. So let's talk a little bit, and I want to get to this intentionality point. It's burning me up. So in order to have any kind of successful diversity, equity, and inclusion program within your corporate walls, and certainly in your boardroom, I believe you need three things: intentionality, accountability, and consistency. It can't just be a bull market phenomenon that when things are going well, lots of attention, big spotlight, lots of money go towards it. But when you get in a bear market environment, you know, things tend to dissipate. It doesn't go away, but it goes from 10 to 2, and you lose your pipeline. So let's talk about the intentionality that you were referring to, Inhi, as a strategy around making sure that you get more women and women of color on the boards. How should companies think about this, and how should CEOs think about leveraging the board with respect to the workforce? Because you just hit on that, Valerie. That's also part of the voice and intentionality we can have as board members.
So I also mentor a lot of women that are interested in joining their boards for the first time. One of the things I think about that's been a consistent, let's say, pattern that I've observed in the boards that are very progressive is first, the intentionality of the criteria, the spec for the role doesn't start with a sitting CEO. Now, you may need a few sitting CEOs in the boardroom, but you don't need necessarily all 8 to 10 members of the boardroom being prior sitting CEOs. The biggest pattern is they actually start with something as simple as skills. What are the skills required to transform this institution to the next level? And when you think about those skills and you unpack it, all of a sudden it just sort of changes the notion of privilege and access, and you start to look at talent through a very different lens. So transformation in terms of maybe it's digital skills, maybe it's transformation in terms of understanding the intersection of industries. So if we believe we're in this era of biology revolution with technology and with industry, maybe it's an industry dimension of others outside your particular domain and industry set. And that was one of the dimensions that actually Dan and I'm on the non-gov committee plus comp and leadership. And we started to think about, okay, historically we've been transitioning from being a pre-IPO to a public company in the first few years, having independent board members, predominantly coming from tech, understanding tech platforms. Now as DocuSign continues to transition to be an enterprise company and global, you know, what are the vertical industries that become important, which includes healthcare and financial services. So it was an intentionality to also add Kane Hayes, who's an African-American CEO with a tremendous amount of background in healthcare and financial services, not in tech, to kind of open the aperture in terms of our understanding of the opportunities for the workflows and the platform. And so it was really thinking through the criteria, not just now, but for the next several years, and thinking board composition through the lens of not just trigger events, individual trigger events, meaning succession and board tenure, but really, you know, for that next phase of growth or the next chapter in the company's history, who are the people that you need around the boardroom to really shepherd and support the management team?
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. So I joined the Walgreens Boots Alliance board about a year ago, and I got a call from Bill Foote, who is chair, who's lead director, and I had served on his board at USG back in the 90s. And Bill said, look, we really needed to diversify our board. We just lost a board member who's Black, and we want to really diversify the board. Do you know anybody who might be interested? I said, what about me? And he said, well, it never occurred to me you want to join a board. I said, well, no, I love Walgreens. I'm in Walgreens every single day. And not long after that, I came in at the tail end of the search for our new CEO. Roz Brewer was on the short list. And in the conversation about Roz's incredible strengths, people took great pride in the fact that we were recruiting a Black woman to be in the Fortune 20. Mm-hmm. And the signal that sent to our workforce around the United States, because of her track record and her experience and who she was, and the pride that people felt in that decision in the boardroom, as well as in the stores. And Roz spent 2 weeks before she started at the company driving from Atlanta to every Walgreens within driving distance where she could get there and back in a day, and introducing herself to the pharmacist. And the spirit of the company lifted with her selection. And so I mention it because it isn't just who's in the board, it's who is the chief executive officer. And then she recruited as a new general counsel, Danielle Gray, a Black woman who served with me in the White House, the White House counsel, and had been also a general counsel herself. And so again, it starts with the intentionality in the boardroom. It starts with the CEO who considers this to be a priority. And to your point, Carla, about sustainability, it can't just be a nice to do. It has to be a business imperative, which means you have to invest in it, not just when things are going well, but when things are really hard. And when you're tightening your belt and you're looking at all the different ways in which you invest your money, and this has to stay a priority. And I think we ought to be thinking long and hard about tying compensation to those kind of performance metrics in the area of diversity and inclusion as well. And if you do that, you get people's attention, and it becomes a lot more intentional when you know your comp is tied to it, right?
Absolutely.
You make it happen.
There's that accountability. I hear you. I feel you. Go ahead, Stefan.
I just wanted to add maybe 3 points. On intentionality first, you got to create the slots. So I think board refreshment is critical. You heard our story about, on average, 1 director a year. I think that's not a bad pace. Yes, you can add directors, but you can't double the size of your board. So you need to go through a refreshment process, and it's not that you vote people off the island. There's a natural cadence to this. The second part I would say is we all love and fully feel the term, I can't be what I can't see. I would add, I can't be what I can't see in action. So that's why we ask all of our directors to mentor at least 2 top potentials or C-suite members, so that they have a personal connection. And then, of course, the C-suite members mentor folks in the organization. Because seeing them in the annual report is nice, but knowing them as a person, knowing their background is critical. How did their career develop? What choices did they make? What are the trade-offs? And so on. And that brings me to my last point. I would almost flip on its head. Everybody on the board has an exemplary accomplishment track record. Everybody has relevant experiences in the businesses we operate in. Everybody has international experience or functional experience that's relevant to the company. But that's not all. Each of them is a person who has been brought up in a certain way, and they bring everything to the table. Like you said, they're consumers, they're customers, they are shareholders, and all of that comes to the boardroom. And I mean, if I just, our 3 persons of color, whether it's Candace, who just joined us, or Maritza, or Jesse, they grew up in completely different circumstances. And all of that comes to the boardroom and enters the conversation. So I think that's really what creates the magic.
Yes. So let me talk about something that you just mentioned in terms of who they are as a person and how they can exercise their voice and what it brings to you as a CEO. One of the things that I have found in the boards that I'm on is asking the question is so powerful with respect to the voice. So, most CEOs already know who they think might succeed them if they got hit by a bus that day, right? But part of the thing that I realized is that if you're not thinking broad enough and giving yourself choices, then you also limit the board. So how do you feel as a CEO when someone asks the question? And I'd like you all to comment on how you've exercised your voice in this way when someone says, this is going to be the person that will take this big job, and you say, so who's number 2? And who's number 3? Are there people of color? Are there women? And what might you do for the next candidate to get them ready so that you have a choice?
Yeah, of course, we discuss this regularly with the board. Not only in the talent committee, but also in the full board succession plan, how deep it is, what is the makeup, what are the development moves, and it is an ongoing conversation, absolutely. And I think one sign of the interest of the board is half of my board is here, and that's the board that half we invited. There is keen interest in that topic and what the pipeline is, and constant conversation.
Okay, and what about you guys? How have you broached that question again as you think about your role in influencing the workforce?
One of the things that I've been a just absolute advocate of in terms of accountability is you have to start with transparency of data. So if you're not willing to publish your data internally for your own employees, you're going to be that much more hesitant to even share it externally. So, and that starts both at every portion of the pipeline development as well as the senior roles. I think you have to have a candid conversation in the boardroom on what does diversity mean for the company and the platform. Meaning it may be diversity of international representation. I think if you think about the lens of industry, you think of different roles and disciplines and functions, where it is now versus the composition and makeup of your customers, your communities of influence, your next generation of suppliers and partners. My belief right now is we're at such a critical moment in the war for talent at every level. And the best talent are going to make choices where those companies are much more intentional about both the purpose of the brand, the evolution of the leadership, the programs and the investment dollars that they put on, not only on some of the conversations that are heavily polarized today, but also in terms of important topics such as sustainability and climate or energy, as well as just thinking about the programmatic development of people from managers, first-line managers, all the way up into the senior ranks. So it's a combination of all of those things.
And Valerie?
So a couple things here. First of all, time is precious. And I think we have to be really careful about companies that we affiliate ourselves with to make sure that we're prepared to attach our reputation to that company. Because let's face it, as a board member, you're not there day in and day out. And you need to know that in the boardroom, to your point about transparency, you are getting accurate information and that you're asking the right questions, not just in terms of the stats, but also something as, it's not really subtle, who presents to the board? And within the last couple of weeks, I've been in 2 board meetings where the question was, who are the high performers who are people of color and women, and are we going to see them present to the board? Because that is a very important experience for someone to have if you're trying to mentor them up the ladder. Coming and doing a presentation is really important. And in one meeting last week in particular, the other board member who is a person of color, and I did not know we had a senior Black man in such an influential position. And we said, well, why haven't we seen him before? I expect to see him now at every meeting, right? And building that pipeline, I think we as board members can be impactful in saying to the CEO, we want to make sure that we're seeing a chart with who's number 1, 2, and 3. What is the racial background and gender of those people that we're saying are high performers? And how can we get them moving up the ladder, including presenting to the board?
Well said. So I want to hit on one point that you just made about compensation and tying the outcome and the change to the compensation, because as a banker, I certainly get that. The money does matter. So I believe that it used to be the case that a CEO's report card was driven by, what they did with revenues, what they did with stock price, what they did with profitability and costs. But I do believe going forward that part of that report card is going to be how impactful were you around the people strategy? What did you do around diversity, equity, and inclusion? On both boards that I'm on, the compensation and management and talent management diversity are all part of that committee. And I believe that that's going to become best practice, because that's a way of a company having some accountability, but you're going to have to be intentional and specific about that. So talk to us a little bit, Stefan, about how you feel, not only at your level, but throughout the organization, tying it somehow to anybody's performance report card, what the pipeline looks like.
Yeah, so two things. One is metrics, transparency, performance rating. It's all included in that. I probably get into trouble here. It depends a bit on the company culture with respect to pay. Given our international nature, people will be almost offended. It's that we pay you to do the right thing. So we pay you to save lives and not hurt people in the factory. We pay you to do this, we pay you to do that. And you end up with a Christmas tree of metrics. So we said, tone from the top, this is what we expected, and if you don't do it, you're in trouble, whether it's on this topic or another topic. So I know it's different in different companies, but that's the right answer for our culture.
And you guys, with respect to the boards, are you moving in that direction, or are you already there with the compensation, management, talent, all in one?
We're there actually, both in terms of IBM, just with Arvind coming on board and compensation being tied to representation, diversity within senior roles. Then on the DocuSign side, absolutely as well. I think the piece that is probably the challenge is, even as you have your C-suite directly say, okay, I am going to hire and intentionally put top diverse talent in those jobs, it's the what about 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels below, that middle gap of development, conscious development of coaching, mentoring, experience, right? Giving those opportunities long before where historically maybe those individuals were not given those opportunities because you had to prove yourself before you were given the chance. I think that mindset has to change, and those programs have to change in order to really shift the numbers. The other thing that I think I've benefited just tremendously, and if you didn't know, Maggie is the chair of DocuSign, and so Maggie is a force of nature onto her own in addition to everything else. And having her as the chair of the board, plus even Teresa Briggs, who's the chair of the audit, having 2 significant women, strong leaders with tremendous domain experience and expertise, gives me another dimension of confidence and perspective to be on this board as an existing operating a board member, not just a seasoned retired board member. And so I think those are things that are really important to the dynamic of the board.
Well, to that point, I'm smiling because there is safety in numbers. I mean, one of the disadvantages of being the only woman or the only person of color is you feel you have to represent. And when there's 3 or 4 of you, it's a lot easier, and there's a critical mass, and it's easier to speak up when you know that there are people around the table who've had similar life experiences. And then the other thing, Carla, that we really haven't talked about yet is that the market forces are to bear on this issue.
Absolutely.
I mean, the consumer and the workforce are demanding it too. And so it's easier for the CEOs to get their mind right about this issue when the consumer, particularly younger consumers, are asking questions about what is the diversity of your board? What is your commitment to sustainability, to the environment? These are topics which are front and center. Glasgow was full of CEOs. Several of you in this room were there this past week. That might not have necessarily happened 10 years ago. And so I think having that touch of where the marketplace is pushing adds to the incentive of creating a healthy and diverse and inclusive culture starting at the very top.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have talked about the issue, the why, and the prescription. I say thank you, Valerie, Inhi, and Stefan. Thank you.